The ancient Egyptians were so obsessed with being clean that they shaved off every hair on their bodies, brushed their teeth with crushed rocks, and smeared toxic lead around their eyeballs on purpose. And weirdly, most of it actually worked. The people who built the pyramids were also running a skincare and sanitation operation so thorough it would make your bathroom cabinet look lazy. Here's the part nobody tells you. When the Greek historian Herodotus showed up in Egypt around 440 BC, he basically wrote a 5-star review of how clean these people were. He said they set cleanliness above seemliness, which is a fancy old way of saying they cared more about being clean than about looking good. And this is coming from a Greek, a guy whose own people were not exactly strangers to a bath. So when the ancient world's biggest gossip columnist travels 1,000 miles and comes back impressed by your hygiene, you're clearly doing something the rest of the world wasn't. Showers before showers. Forget the image of a queen soaking in a giant tub full of milk. That's a Hollywood invention. Most Egyptians did not soak at all. They washed standing up, with a servant pouring water over them from a jug, behind a little waist-high stone screen that worked as a privacy wall. It was, functionally, a shower. 3,000 years before anyone invented a showerhead, the Egyptians had already worked out that running water over your body beats marinating in your own dirty bathwater, and the washing was constant. The average person cleaned their hands, face, and feet before meals, after meals, before bed, and again the moment they woke up. Bathing was a daily expectation for most people, not a once-a-month treat for the rich. Households kept basins, jugs, and shallow footbaths made of stone, clay, faience, or wood, and these footbaths were being mass-produced as far back as 2181 BC. Egypt had a dedicated foot-washing industry, while large chunks of the world were still figuring out the basics of farming. For the poorer majority, the bathroom was simply the Nile itself. People waded into the river or the irrigation canals to wash, often together, which was social and practical and free. The downside, which they could not possibly have known, was that the very water rinsing them clean was teeming with parasites, but we'll get to that catastrophe later. For now, just know that whether you were a farmer in the river or a noble behind a screen wall, daily washing was simply what an Egyptian did. If you were royalty, you went bigger. The palace of Akhenaten and Nefertiti at a city called Amarna, built around 1350 BC, had an actual indoor bathroom, a shower stall with a stone slab to stand on, a toilet right next door. Nefertiti, the woman with arguably the most famous face in human history, had better indoor plumbing than some people reading this had in their first apartment. The water itself was usually cold, hauled in by hand, and sometimes scented, because if you're going to the trouble of a private bathroom, you might as well make it smell nice. The magic salt. Now, the Egyptians didn't have soap, not the bar kind you're picturing. What they had was something stranger and arguably better, called natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt that the Egyptians scooped out of dried-up lake beds northwest of modern Cairo, in a place still called Wadi el Natron, which roughly translates to the salt fields. Chemically, it's mostly sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, with a bit of regular table salt mixed in. If that sounds dull, understand that this powder was the duct tape of ancient Egypt. They scrubbed their skin with it, they cleaned their teeth with it, they mixed it into their homemade soap, they gargled it as mouthwash, they scoured their houses with it. Priests washed with natron before stepping into sacred temple spaces, because you do not walk up to a god smelling like yesterday. And then, in the ultimate flex, they used the exact same salt to mummify their dead. The body got packed and buried in dry natron for about 35 to 40 days, which pulled out every drop of moisture and created an environment so dry and alkaline that bacteria simply gave up and went home. It could shrink a corpse's weight by up to 75%. So the same humble powder a priest used to freshen his breath in the morning was the powder that would preserve his body for the next 3,000 years. When we marvel at how lifelike a mummy looks today, we are basically admiring the long-term results of really aggressive table salt. Talk about brand loyalty. Soap, sort of. For actual washing, the Egyptians took animal fats and vegetable oils, mixed in those alkaline salts, and boiled the whole thing down into a soft, soap-like paste. It cleaned, it foamed a little, and it left your skin smelling considerably less like someone who'd spent the day hauling stone under the desert sun. We even have the recipe written down. There's a medical document called the Ebers Papyrus, dated to around 1550 BC, and it's essentially a giant health encyclopedia stretching over 100 pages. It describes a soap-like material made from oils and salts used to treat skin diseases. So washing wasn't always strictly about smelling good. Sometimes it was prescribed, the way a doctor today hands you a cream for a rash. And that points to something important about Egypt. The line between beauty product and medicine basically did not exist. Cleaning your skin, healing your skin, and protecting your skin from the brutal sun were all the same project. They moisturized obsessively with castor oil and animal fats, partly out of vanity and partly because dry, cracked skin in that climate was a genuine health risk. Looking good and staying alive were, conveniently, the same routine. Bald was beautiful. Here's where their hygiene gets genuinely intense. The Egyptians did not just trim their hair, they removed nearly all of it. Head hair, body hair, facial hair, eyebrows in mourning, the lot, both men and women. Smooth, bare skin meant you were clean, pure, and high class, while a big bushy beard was something they associated with foreigners and scruffy barbarians. In Egypt, your hair was a hygiene problem to be solved, not a fashion statement to be grown out. The reasons were brutally practical. No hair meant nowhere for lice to set up camp. And in a sweltering climate next to a giant river full of insects, lice were a relentless menace. So they shaved their heads down to the scalp, and then, because a fully bald head looks a bit severe at a dinner party, they wore wigs. Elaborate, expensive ones, built from human hair and styled with beeswax to hold the shape. After foreign rulers called the Hyksos arrived, some cheaper wigs even used horsehair. Think about the logic for a second. They removed their natural hair for cleanliness, then placed fake hair back on top for style. Ancient Egypt was a place where the obsession with being clean and the obsession with looking good were both cranked to maximum and somehow met in the middle, on top of a bald head. To strip the hair off, they had a serious toolkit. Copper and bronze razors, sharpened to an edge. Tweezers, some made from bone or seashell, for plucking. Pumice stones to scrub away stubble, and they had sugaring, which is the direct ancestor of modern waxing. You cook a sticky paste of honey or sugar with a little water, warm it up, spread it on the skin, let it grab every hair, and rip it off. People still pay good money for that exact treatment in salons today, often calling it the latest trend. The Egyptians were getting full-body waxes thousands of years before the word esthetician existed. Children, by the way, were mostly left with a single braided lock of hair on the side of an otherwise shaved head, a style so iconic it became the hieroglyph for child. Eyeliner, that healed. Okay, this one is genuinely amazing, and it's the part almost everyone gets completely wrong. That thick black eyeliner you see ringing the eyes in every Egyptian painting, the stuff that makes everyone look permanently fierce and unbothered, is called kohl. It was made mostly from a crushed lead mineral called galena, ground fine and mixed with oil or fat into a paste, then stored in beautiful little pots and applied with a small rounded stick. Men wore it, women wore it, children wore it. It was as standard as putting on shoes. Now, you'd think smearing lead around your eyes every day is a catastrophically bad idea, and over a lifetime, yeah, lead is a poison. But here's the twist that earned an actual modern science headline. In 2010, a French research team led by a chemist named Philippe Walter analyzed 52 samples of kohl from containers sitting in the Louvre Museum in Paris. They discovered that the Egyptians weren't simply grinding up natural minerals, they were deliberately manufacturing two specific lead compounds that do not occur in nature, through a slow, fiddly chemical process that would take days. The obvious question is why anyone would bother. Because those particular lead salts, in tiny amounts, triggered the skin cells around the eye to pump out up to 240% more nitric oxide. Nitric oxide revs up the immune system and helps the body attack invading bacteria. And eye infections were a massive, constant problem in Egypt, where you've got a flood-prone, marshy, fly-infested river running through the whole country. So, the Egyptians had, through pure trial and error over centuries, basically engineered a cosmetic that doubled as a low-grade medicine for eye disease. Their eyeliner was quietly fighting off infections. The fashion statement was also a flu shot for your face. It didn't stop there. The black kohl cut down on the sun's harsh glare, which is exactly why you still see football players smearing dark grease under their eyes today. And it helped keep flies away from the eyeballs. One product doing 3 jobs at once. To be fair, scientists are quick to point out that lead is still toxic, and you absolutely should not try this at home. But the fact remains, an ancient people accidentally turned makeup into medicine. Your eyeliner does not work nearly that hard. In earlier centuries, they also wore a green eye paint made from crushed malachite, a copper mineral, before black kohl became the dominant look. Whole cosmetic kits have turned up in tombs, complete with grinding palettes, polished bronze mirrors, applicator sticks, and tiny lidded pots of pigment, all packed away so the dead could keep doing their makeup in the next life. These weren't disposable trinkets, they were treasured personal items, buried alongside jewelry and food, because for an Egyptian, your eye paint was as essential to your identity as your name. A face without kohl was a face that wasn't quite ready to be seen, in this world or the one after it. Crushed rocks for teeth. Dental hygiene is where the Egyptians both spectacularly win and tragically lose. On the winning side, they clean their teeth with chew sticks, which were just frayed twigs from particular trees. It turns out those twigs naturally contain fluoride, antibacterial compounds, and tough little fibers, so they genuinely worked as toothbrushes. People in some parts of the world still use the exact same thing today and have great teeth for it. We also have what's often called the oldest toothpaste recipe ever written down. It survives on a papyrus kept in Vienna, and the recipe is shockingly precise. 1 part rock salt, 2 parts dried mint, 1 part dried iris flower, and 20 grains of pepper, all ground into a fine powder. You mix it with a bit of spit and you scrub. Modern dentists who examined it admitted it would actually clean teeth quite well, though the pepper probably made for a startling morning. Quick honesty check though, that famous recipe is written in Greek and dates to roughly the 4th century AD, so it comes from the much later, Greek-influenced chapter of Egyptian history, not the pyramid-building Golden Age. Pharaonic Egyptians had their own tooth powders for thousands of years before, and the Ebers Papyrus even lists mouthwashes made from things like celery and bran. But that one viral recipe everyone quotes is a relative latecomer. And now, the losing part. Egyptian teeth were absolutely destroyed. Not by sugar, since they barely had any, but by sand. They ground their grain into flour using rough stone tools, and tiny fragments of sand and stone grit got mixed straight into the dough. Every single loaf of bread was secretly a sheet of sandpaper. Over a lifetime of chewing that gritty bread, Egyptian teeth wore down to flat, painful nubs. One study of around 4,800 ancient teeth found that nearly 90% showed serious wear. The grinding eventually exposed the soft, living pulp inside the tooth. Bacteria flooded in, and agonizing abscesses ballooned at the roots. Even the pharaohs couldn't dodge it. Ramesses II, the most powerful man in the entire known world, had teeth so ground down and so packed with abscesses that some researchers seriously think a raging tooth infection may have contributed to his death. The man conquered nations, fathered around 100 children, and built temples the size of small mountains, and in the end his own breakfast bread might have helped kill him. There is a humbling thought to chew on, carefully, with whatever enamel you have left. The sand toilet. Let's talk bathrooms, because the wealthy Egyptians had genuinely good ones. A well-off home came with a real toilet. The deluxe model was a carved limestone seat. The budget version was a wooden one, and it sat over a large ceramic pot partly filled with sand. You did your business, you scooped some sand over the top, and the smell and the mess were sealed away. No water wasted, no waste splashing into the river, no funk taking over the household. It's actually a clever, low-tech system. By keeping waste in a sand pot instead of dumping it straight into the Nile, they kept the water they drank and bathed in noticeably cleaner, even without fully understanding the connection to disease. Archaeologists have found these setups at Amarna and at a famous workers' village called Deir el-Medina, the gated community where the skilled craftsmen who carved the royal tombs lived. Some of these homes had a small bathroom built right beside the bedroom, which makes it the earliest known version of the en-suite. They even had portable wooden toilet stools, with a keyhole-shaped hole cut in the seat, for taking on the road. A travel toilet, 3,000 years before the porta potty. But let's not get carried away and picture the whole country lounging in comfort. This was strictly the upper-class experience. There were no citywide sewers, no network drains like the Romans would eventually build. The fancy limestone thrones simply do not turn up in the small, crowded houses of the working poor. If you were a farmer, your toilet was a humble wooden stool with a hole, or honestly just a discreet spot out in the fields. Clean, comfortable living in Egypt, much like today, came with a price tag attached: perfume and the cone myth. Egyptians wanted to smell incredible, and they took the project seriously. Their most prized scent was an incense blend called kifi, a wildly complicated mix of frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, juniper, mint, and a dozen other ingredients, some shipped in from a distant trade land they called punt. It was so precious, it was mostly burned in temples to please the gods, because evidently even the divine appreciated a good room spray. For everyday human body odor, they got resourceful and a little disgusting. One medical text recommends a paste of lettuce, myrrh, and incense rubbed onto your skin as deodorant. Another suggests a frankly nightmarish cream made from ostrich egg, nuts, tamarisk, and crushed tortoiseshell, all mixed with fat and smeared across your arms and torso to battle the sweat. So the next time your roll-on runs dry, take comfort that at least it didn't require a tortoise. Now for the famous one. You've seen those Egyptian paintings where people at banquets are wearing little cones balanced on top of their heads. For well over a century, historians confidently explained that these were cones of perfumed fat or wax that slowly melted in the heat, dripping fragrance down the wig and over the shoulders all evening. It's a fantastic story. It's in nearly every documentary. There was just one tiny problem. Nobody had ever actually found one, not a single physical cone. For decades, the entire theory rested on paintings and pure confident guessing. Then, in 2019, archaeologists digging at Amarna finally unearthed two real ones, sitting on the heads of bodies in ancient graves. And the melting perfume story promptly fell apart. The cones were hollow, made of beeswax, and contained little to no fragrant fat at all. There was no melted residue soaked into the wearer's hair, either, so they almost certainly weren't dripping perfume hats. They were far more likely symbolic objects, tied to ideas about purity, fertility, and rebirth in the afterlife. Sometimes the dull, real answer beats the fun, fake one, and the internet's favorite Egyptian fun fact turned out to be 100 years of art historians confidently making it up: cleanliness as religion. To really understand why the Egyptians were like this, you have to grasp that being clean wasn't just about comfort or vanity. It was about the gods. Cleanliness was holiness. Full stop. To approach the divine, you had to be pure, and pure meant scrubbed, shaved, and spotless, body and clothing alike. The priests took this to a level that makes the rest of us look like swamp creatures. According to Herodotus, the priests shaved their entire bodies every other day, specifically so that not a single louse or anything impure could cling to them while they served the gods. They bathed twice during the day and twice during the night, always in cold water. That, by the way, is the true source of the famous Egyptians bathed 4 times a day claim that gets thrown around. It wasn't every Egyptian, it was the priests, and it was a strict religious duty, not a casual lifestyle choice. They wore nothing but linen, never wool, and they scoured their bronze drinking cups every single day, with no exceptions allowed. Egyptian men were also circumcised, and Herodotus claims they did it, in his words, for the sake of cleanliness, considering it better to be cleanly than comely. Even their sacred funeral guide, the Book of the Dead, instructs that the deceased should arrive in the afterlife clean, dressed in fresh clothing, wearing white sandals, painted with eye paint, and anointed with the finest myrrh oil. You weren't even permitted to show up dirty after death. In ancient Egypt, being grimy wasn't just rude, it could genuinely cost you your shot at eternity. White linen and laundry, clean skin was only half the equation. The Egyptians were also fanatical about clean clothes, and their clothing of choice was white linen, woven from the flax that grew along the river. White was the color of purity, and keeping a linen robe truly white in a dusty desert country took real, grinding effort. This is hygiene most people never think about, the part that happens after you step out of the shower. Egypt had a whole profession dedicated to it. Professional launderers, sometimes called washermen, hauled enormous loads of dirty linen down to the riverbank, soaked them, beat them against the rocks, scrubbed them with natron, and rinsed them in the current. Then they wrung them out, stretched them, and folded them into crisp stacks. Wealthy households sent out their laundry the way you might drop off dry cleaning today, except the washing happened in a river full of very real dangers, and this was not a cushy job. An ancient text from the Middle Kingdom, called the Satire of the Trades, runs through a list of miserable careers to convince a young student that becoming a scribe is far better than the alternatives. It openly mocks the launderer, describing a man who has to wash clothes on the riverbank right next to the crocodiles, getting filthy in other people's grime all day, with no clean part of him left. So the people responsible for keeping Egypt looking spotless were themselves covered head to toe in everyone else's dirt, dodging actual predators in the water. Somebody always pays for the clean shirt, and in Egypt it was the guy gambling with a crocodile so a noble could attend a banquet in dazzling white. The worm in the story. So after all of this, the shaving, the natron, the magic eyeliner, the sand toilets, the 4 daily priestly baths, you'd reasonably assume the Egyptians were the healthiest people on the planet. And here is the gut punch that ties this whole story together. They were absolutely riddled with parasites. When scientists examine Egyptian mummies, the results are genuinely grim. One large review found that up to 65% of mummies tested positive for schistosomiasis, a nasty parasite caught from standing river water that causes bleeding, exhaustion, and slow organ damage. Around 40% carried head lice, the exact thing they shaved their entire bodies to avoid. Roughly 22% had malaria. They also found guinea worm, a horror show parasite that grows up to a meter long inside the body before slowly emerging through the skin, and visceral leishmaniasis on top of it. The Ebers Papyrus even describes treating the guinea worm, and calcified specimens have been pulled out of real mummies to prove it. Archaeologists have also dug fine-toothed lice combs out of the trash heaps of ancient towns. Under a microscope, one comb from a later Egyptian site still had adult lice, young nymphs, and an egg wedged between its teeth. Thousands of years later, the physical evidence of a daily war against bugs is still sitting right there in the comb, frozen mid-battle. Here's the brutal irony at the center of it all. The Nile was the source of everything they had: their food, their water, their wealth, their entire civilization. And the Nile was also a parasite superhighway. The same river they bathed in, drank from, sailed on, and literally worshipped as a god, was quietly pumping worms and disease into their bodies the entire time. They understood ritual purity better than almost anyone in the ancient world. They simply had no concept of germs. You can shave every hair off your body, brush your teeth with mint, and scour your cup until it gleams. But if you don't know the water itself is the enemy, the water wins every time. So, were the ancient Egyptians clean? By the standards of their own age, genuinely, shockingly, yes. They were almost certainly the most fastidious civilization of the entire ancient world. They invented the shower stall, the sand toilet, the travel potty, healing eyeliner, and breath-freshening salt, and they pulled it all off 3,000 years before anyone had the faintest idea what a germ was. They just happened to do every bit of it while living right on top of the single biggest bowl of parasite soup in the ancient world. Clean hands, worm-filled guts, fresh breath, freshly pressed white linen, and the best-smelling funerals in all of human history. A people doing absolutely everything right, and still losing to a problem they couldn't even see. Honestly, that might be the most relatable thing I've ever heard.